when I was a law student at UC Berkeley, which was around the time that critical race theory was just coming into existence in the mid to late 1980s. So it was fairly brand new to the legal academy, kind of offshooting out of critical legal studies as well as feminist jurisprudence, right? They used to have these conferences of critical legal studies, and then you'd have your pockets of feminists and pockets of race scholars, not unlike what you're doing here perhaps, right? That you just kind of congregate off to the side, having side conversations about what might be going on in the plenary. And then it got to a point where there are enough folks to say, you know, some of these main approaches don't necessarily apply in the same way, or we have very specific critiques. And then it led to first kind of like a separate panel of critical race scholars being invited to the main conference, and led to publications and then the kind of institutionalization. But I think what people discovered from working separately was many of the shared commitments and shared insights, right, that arose, that began to form what's known today as critical race theory, okay? And intersectionality as being one of those key strands within critical race theory as well. So when I was a law student, I was very fortunate that these conversations were taking place. And it was also at the time of tremendous change and student activism in the United States in the mid to late 1980s. So you all have heard about, you know, of course, the movement from the 1960s, the civil rights movement, and then many of the student movements across the world. But then it sort of, there's a dormancy period of the 1970s through, you know, kind of the election of Ronald Reagan. But after Ronald Reagan's election, you begin to see more broad-based national student movement, and interestingly around the issue of apartheid in South Africa. And so for many student movements at the time, we began to have more of a unified, collective, insurgent voice around trying to bring attention, focus solidarity movements to eliminate apartheid in South Africa, and specifically with the task of divestment within universities. And you know, many of the students who were active in those efforts then later were raising similar questions about why our own institutions also were practicing a form of academic apartheid, from the faculty down to graduate students, undergraduate students, staff, and the connection between curriculum and community. So that became a sort of offshoot movement from the engagement with separation, you know, in the international context and bringing it back home. So I was very fortunate that Berkeley, along with like Columbia University in New York, were some of the sites where a lot of this activity was very vibrant. So when I became a junior professor of law, I began to write, and one of the first things that I wrote was looking at the specifics of sexual harassment that I had witnessed and had advocated on at pretty much every university that I had been at, involving women of color and specifically Asian American women, and that there was a particular vulnerability I wrote about with regards to Asian American women because of the convergence of both the racial stereotype of Asian Americans as this kind of meek model minority, and also because of the sort of gendered dimension of that stereotype vis-a-vis Asian American women, that pit Asian American women as sort of from a, you know, patriarchal heteronormative perspective, as a kind of ideal woman who's much more submissive and not as outspoken, as, you know, white women might be, and that was the sort of dominant construction of Asian American women. So it was a convergence of both of those racialized and gendered stereotypes coming together that I argued made Asian American women on campus particularly vulnerable, both in terms of being targets of sexual harassment, but also in terms of the difficulties of addressing that harassment. So that was my initial work. And of course, intersectionality as a theory was primary in terms of developing that analysis. I had no idea, you know, how my work might be perceived or accepted or not. And I don't even remember exactly when I met Professor Crenshaw, but I can just say that I was so relieved when I did meet her that she was the most supportive mentor. You know, sounds like the way people talk about Professor Arndt here is how I was able to establish a relationship with Professor Crenshaw, someone that really, you know, was a sort of provided a theoretical grounding for me, and yet, you know, it was not static, you know, so that she would be constantly reformulating and challenging, you know, contemporary events and analysis of such in terms of using our critical faculties toward that. So that, you know, and then I was able to collaborate with her on a number of political and research projects. And I think the one that is perhaps the most circulated is the science piece from the Women's Journal, Feminist Journal, that was published in 2013 that I'll make a couple of references to. So that's just a little bit in terms of my own background, in terms of how I became involved. I guess I started out as a sort of political activist, and then, you know, became a graduate student in my doctoral program in ethnic studies that I added after I realized, following my first year of law school, that I did not want to be a lawyer. And then that's when I took the kind of academic route from there. Okay, so that's the background. I apologize at the outset if my prepared comments are too basic for you. It's hard to know, but I thought it's important to try to get everybody on the same page first, but then we can, of course, go wherever you want with this. So I'm going to just begin with some very basics in terms of intersectionality, and then we will open up with comments from Professor Arndt and the soon-to-be Dr. Lee. All right, so with that, why don't we get started? Okay. So, I thought that we would, wait, what happened to the second slide? Was that already up? Okay. So this is what we kind of have planned for the workshop today. And we do want a lot of it to be interactive and engaging with you. And in order to start with my prepared, oh, yeah, you may be right. I have a few questions that I am using to focus these opening comments. What is intersectionality? Why is it important? What are its origins and context? How does it travel? And what are some of the challenges of translation? Okay. But just based on some of the science article, I'll just share with you some initial thoughts as well with regards to this definitional question. As many of you know, Professor Crenshaw's work, it's not to say that intersectionality did not exist before 1989, because there is a long tradition of theorizing multiple forms of subordination, particularly within the Black feminist tradition in the United States and elsewhere. But it was really her kind of perhaps taking all of those strands of work and writing it in this law review article, the demarginalizing article in 1989, that actually identified the term intersectionality with this idea. And I think that we can understand it as this analytic sensibility, or perhaps a heuristic device that really does try to look at difference, dynamics of difference and solidarity of sameness, right, within structures of subordination. Okay. All right. It also tried to challenge, this kind of single axis attempt to bifurcate, let's say, race from class, or class from gender, or gender from ability, or ability from sexuality, etc. So it would be attempting to develop a more multi-axial way of looking at problems and possible solutions. So these are very basic kinds of definitions with regards to this heuristic in particular. And so in science, we also had the advantage in 2013 of kind of looking backwards to say, over the past 2.5 decades or so, what have we seen that has developed in the variety of disciplines through which intersectionality has traveled to form what we are calling intersectionality studies. And so we were able to identify that there have been roughly 3, very loosely defined set of engagements in intersectionality studies. First, identifying intersectionality as a frame of analysis to a wide range of research and teaching projects in a variety of context-specific inquiries, okay? And so that's the kind of analytic framework approach to intersectionality, right? And I guess that would be perhaps my initial engagement with it in my first article on sexual harassment. We also saw that in many fields, it also exists as this sort of discursive investigation, as a theory and methodology. And it's an approach that includes, but is not limited to, questions and debates about the way intersectionality has been developed, adopted, and adapted within the disciplines. With a varying degree of, let's say, I guess this is the part of our science piece where we acknowledge that sometimes people are critiquing intersectionality without necessarily having read that much about it. So it exists at these different levels, in terms of engaging the theory or as a methodology. And then also it exists as a sort of praxis-based understanding of the normative and political dimensions of contemporary problems and issues to transform intersectional dynamics. Okay. So looking backwards, that's what we kind of surveyed, all of the different sort of articulations of intersectionality to say that here are at least 3, different manifestations, let's say, of intersectionality, right? So that, we need to be able to stand in terms of this praxis-based understanding, the ways in which, on-the-ground movements inform intersectionality theory, and how theory can also be used to help improve struggles for justice. Okay, so those were some of the attempts to try to take stock of the literature and what has developed. All right, so that was the clip that I wanted to share. If you want to see the rest of it, you can just Google Crenshaw, The Urgency of Intersectionality. I think that Professor Crenshaw lays out, the compelling significance of how, at least prior to some of her articulation, it was rather invisible to see the ways in which the law was dealing with multiple subordination. So if we move on, I think that leads to the next question that I had up. What are the origins and context of intersectionality? And as Professor Crenshaw was sharing, some of the details of her Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex article from 1989, it really raised questions of who is the idealized legal subject, right? Especially in liberal theory, illustrated through the De Graaf and Reed case, right? Who benefits and who's burdened by a definition of the liberal subject, right? That is highly individualized, right? Separated out of history. And why this is a rather top-down approach and why a more bottom-up approach might be preferable. Okay. So those are some of the, I think, useful context for understanding the origins and context. Additionally, if you think about U.S. anti-discrimination law, I don't know how familiar you might be, but we had a series of, if you go back, first post-Civil War Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, under what's known as the first Reconstruction in the late 19th century. And then after the Civil Rights Movement in the mid-20th century, we had a number of civil rights laws. And so we have the emergence of modern anti-discrimination law in the form of what's called Title VII of our Civil Rights Act from 1964. That basically says employers shall not discriminate because of, and then you have all these different categories, okay? And so, if you think about that, then you also have to see that there are sort of pre-existing legal subjects, right, under Title VII. And then, you can consider what category did the De Graaf and Reed plaintiffs challenging General Motors, what did they pursue? They didn't pick this pre-existing route, right? And they tried to combine. However, you can see that the judge rejected those claims, okay? So in a way, intersectionality emerged out of a critique of the development of the liberal subject in the law, but it wasn't limited to simply that sort of liberal vision for equality. It was using that as a starting point to illustrate the sort of structural legal barriers, right, to justice, and for Black women to be rendered pretty much non-cognizable before the law, that they had to disaggregate their claim and to pass muster, if it fits within the race paradigm and proof structures for anti-discrimination or the gender one. And you can see how, it could turn out that you may not prevail under either, right? And it was the same thing, if you think about it, for those of you familiar with the law of harassment as it's developed in the United States, if you have what's known as hostile environment harassment, right? Not the kind of quid pro quo, not the kind of Harvey Weinstein harassment, right? But the hostile environment harassment, that proof requires that you show that there are multiple contexts of or severe or pervasive type of harassment, okay? So either you could have theoretically one very severe, often a sort of physical contact in violation, right, might qualify as under pervasive or severe, or the pervasive referring to the quantity, right, if you have multiple incidents. But in certain examples of sexual harassment, if of Black women being subjected to racist, like a noose or the use of the N-word, and then other examples of sexist harassment, in terms of the classic kind of Playboy centerfolds or very vulgar jokes or comments about women's bodies, or epithets, right? But under the sort of court's single axis approach, they would say, well, those don't add up to enough because you only have one in this category and one in that category, and so that's neither pervasive nor severe. So that's just another example in sexual harassment in addition to the law of employment discrimination where this singular approach was detrimental to intersectional subjects, right? And so you can think about, why is it that black women couldn't be filing as women, right? Because the predicate was white women had been hired and therefore you experience no violation as a woman. And if black men are on the work site, then clearly there's no problem with race going on either. Okay, so those are the kind of grounding elemental assumptions. And I just wanted to share that was the sort of original framework that gave birth to intersectionality, and its relevance I think will come up now when we think about how does intersectionality travel and what are some of the challenges of doing intersectionality in other times and places. So if we consider now the question of how does intersectionality travel, right? We know that, perhaps it arose out of this US post-civil rights, perhaps post-racial context, right? Because it's after the passage of the various civil rights acts that attempted to desegregate society after Jim Crow, right? So in that sense, it's post-civil rights, arguably post-racial, right? But what happens when it travels outside of the specific context of the US? And I think I heard from people talking about how do you apply it to a different context, African context or other locations, right? As a traveling concept, what is its usefulness, right? And other questions that arise is how may intersectionality be either productively engaged or possibly appropriated, right? So I think these are some of the interesting questions, right, that a number of scholars and activists in what's becoming known as critical race theory Europe, right, are trying to look at, right? People looking at these questions of intersectionality within the continent. Okay, and so if we think about what are these challenges now of translation of intersectionality to a German context, let's say, what are the current problems and issues, right, confronting intersectional subjects in Europe and in Germany in particular? What are the ideological and institutional structures that impede being able to address these problems, much less provide redress? And how does this interrogation of sameness and difference compare, right, with the origins? So let me just pause here and get your feedback on this, because this is the part that I am actually most interested in, that I've been trying to piece together in the 5 summers that I've spent in Berlin, working with a variety of groups on the ground, trying to answer some of these questions to make the sort of traveling concept real in more local contexts. So let me just open up for some initial responses and then I'll have a short closing before turning it over to our commenters. Does anyone want to start with any of these questions?
So as I said, I'm working on the subject of men or women in diaspora, and I saw this growing demographic of basically people of MENA region coming to Germany, and the way they are being they're being engaged in a society, or they're being represented or talked of, and so on and so forth. And I see, like, as I said, we talked about this advertisement that we discussed. So I see like pictures of, I see the men or women with hijab. It's just like becoming a commodity of in democratic discourse, basically. Without like so much paying attention to basically where does she come from, you know. We are still having problem framing religion and the interplay of that with the culture for those regions, and we barely scratch the surface, and then we just like allow politicians to frame it, and then with a caption like, here I'm free to decide how I want to dress, without really showing the battles behind it. I mean, like, there is no discussion of like what will happen if you choose hijab, or like what will happen if you decide to unveil. So there's no discussion of that, and we see like a lot of appropriation going on with this basically intersectional subject.
Right, so Shirin was sharing with me, I'm sure, the AFD posters that you may have seen around with it had the like image of a veiled woman.
Yes.
Okay. And then this kind of slogan, right?
Yes,
So,
exactly.
we will free you, right?
Yes.
Okay, so that's one type of issue and problem, and the ways in which racialization in the European context has a strong overlap also with religious minorities, right?
May I add another angle to the same thing? Because and that you know, intersectional subject is being completely differently treated in diasporic community. So at the same time that she's being framed like that, there are so many Islamophobic, you know, ideas being scattered, and just like people are feeling uncomfortable if that is going to be the only face of MENA population in diaspora. So this is very, I mean, like, Islamophobia is just like actually like growing within the community of diasporic people. So that's something that I was able to see and just trace.
Right, right. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, so relating to that, I think one of the major problems also in Germany is that there is no awareness whatsoever about racism. It's always, when the people start talking about racism, it's either apartheid, National Socialism, which is Germany's past, which we overcame successfully, or the US.
Yeah.
So people put a question mark, so why do you want to talk about racism? But if you cannot talk about racism, you cannot talk about intersectionality. Right. Because what is allegedly being accepted is, we might have they call it like, sexism, they might call it like Frauenfeindlichkeit, so it's a kind of hostility towards women, but we have solved the problem well. Because like compared to other countries, look at us. So, you want to talk about discrimination? Talk about how women are treated in Iran. Talk about, you know, how blacks are treated in the US. But, you know, and so that's the most challenging thing, to implement this discourse in Germany. Because they it's very difficult to accept that we have a discrimination problem. We have racism.
Yeah.
And we have sexism as a structural, systematic problem.
Yeah. And that's perhaps one of the ideological structures in terms of doing intersectionality in the German context, right? Is that discussing Rasse is verboten, right? You're not even supposed to use the word Rasse, right?
It's so contaminated.
Right.
As if race
it's so tied in with National Socialism that you're not really supposed to talk about
and
race.
People don't associate race, Rasse, with blackness, with colonialism, whiteness.
Right, right. I think that's one of our challenges when we are looking at contemporary asylum law, you know, following the refugee crisis of 2014-15, right? And to go back to the origins of asylum law that were really focused on remedying victims of National Socialism within Europe, but not looking at the longer legacy of victims of colonialism, right? So you have a sort of way in which asylum law closes off redressing, victims trying to escape from the legacies of colonialism, right? Okay, so those are some of the basics. Any other thoughts on some of these three questions here? What are you thinking? I can see your furrowed brow.
I'm trying to follow.
Well, let me ask you this. To what extent do you believe that Germany is a post-racial society? Is it?
No.
It's not. Why, do you think? You're saying no too. Professor, you are Professor Oliver? No, you are.
I am doctor. not professor.
Bye.
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 Yeah.
Okay.
It's my name. No, I don't think so. I mean, I come from France, so it's
Is France a post-racial society?
not.
No.
Also.
Why not?
I think in France you have a recognition of colonialism, because you have community, and so it's difficult to deny. The French role in colonization during the colonization. So it's just there now. You have discussion, but. In terms of university and the discussion, for example, concerning post-colonial studies or intersectionality, some things which is coming now, but it's some things which is new, and there is really a reluctance to speak about these issues.
Right.
And I think that in Germany, there is a big problem of structural racism, in the university and also in the representation of others.
Right.
And this is something which is really, I think, present, and even more than France, for example.
Are there race-based remedies in France or Germany?
Sorry?
Are there race-based remedies, laws, anti-discrimination laws in France or Germany?
Yeah, but the problem is there is not like in the US. The recognition of race. So in France, for example, there is not a database on how many black or Afro-French, and it's the same in Germany. So actually this, the racial discourse is really due to the past, to the Second World War, and is different from the US. So and there is this hypocrisy also to. So of course you can go and you can speak about discrimination in terms of racial, gender discrimination, but this is really difficult to prove. So because there is not recognition of this racial component.
Right.
Yeah, if I just want to base my experience on what I've been, because I've been given for almost 4 years, I think formally the law doesn't allow you to discriminate people. I work in Bavaria, exactly. So within the law, if it is proven that the employer is discriminating you, so they can get into trouble. But if adding to that, I think I live in Berlin. In the bus, it's also written that discrimination is forbidden in Germany. But out of that, you always have, because I myself, I've seen myself into the ground where people throw you, words and forms of images that bring you back to slavery. You have white people who call you nigger, for instance. Here in Germany, it happens online. You see people who are always there projecting you. They want to bring you back to those areas, and you understand this Korean fantasy is still living here in this current time. So these structures are still there, and basically, and it is really reinforcing some other aspect of it.
Right, and what's interesting is there seems to be no way to name that in many ways. If you're not allowed to even point out that there is something racial going on, right? And that there's movements actually to remove race and race as a category from the Constitution. In the French context, it's sort of under this universal notion of republicanism, right? Fraternity, égalité, right? Right, fraternity, right? And so it needs to have this sort of universal dimension and not any kind of particularity, right? And so in both, you also see an aversion to any race-based statistics, right? And so therefore, even if it may be kind of theoretical, the state may be theoretically committed to anti-discrimination, you can't really in any way prove it. How would you prove a case of racial profiling by the police like some groups have tried to do in the United States, right? Well, you have to rely on some data to show the disparity in the traffic stops. And yet, because of what my colleague Cengiz Barskanmaz refers to as German exceptionalism, because of its entanglement with National Socialism or even in the Second Republic in terms of colonialism, you know, with racism, that there is an aversion really to talking about and naming race and rasa, as Professor Art's work also has shown. So I think those are at least some of the ideological structures that we can look at that presents an additional challenge to doing critical race theory and intersectionality work in Europe. And so some of my earlier work on post-racialism, some of the CRT European scholars have tried to apply to, you know, like a continental experience. But I would ask and say, are we sure that we're talking about these countries as post-racial when they haven't even undergone any kind of civil rights movement or challenging or the creation of specific race-based remedies for many of the structural problems, right? And so in the same way, you don't see those sorts of developments, which presents, I would say, bigger challenges, right? And in that sense, you could perhaps conceive of Germany as being pre-racial, right? Because it's prior to the development of some sort of unified national movement, you know, that's sort of civil rights based, that produces then a set of liberal legal reforms, you know, constructed around race, okay? So that I just introduced to you as one way of looking at the challenges of traveling theory and how you can make it real in terms of the context of your own local experience, right? So those are just some of where I wanted to end up here. Let me see. And so before I turn it over to the commenters, just a couple of, I guess, summaries that the US context does originate in this legal system, right, that did engage the liberal subject. Also in class action civil rights litigation. That doesn't really exist here in Germany, right? The concept of class action, you may have strategic litigation, but that's very different. And you may have sort of model plaintiff litigation, but that's also very different and often consumer-based and not civil rights-based, okay? So that whole de Graffenried case that Professor Crenshaw was talking about, that's not really known here. So that sort of groupedness that's available as a legal structural remedy, I guess that's some of what I was referring to as the absence of sort of a post-racial context here in Europe. We are decidedly, let's say, post-racial, as I have argued. I don't think that we could say the same of Germany, you know, or France or other European countries. And this is the question that we were asking. How does this local aversion to seeing race or even discussing rasa preclude intersectional analysis or practice? And how do institutional structures within the academy preclude or inhibit intersectional theorizing or practices? One of the reasons why I went into law, because I actually started my career as a political scientist in the social sciences, was because there was already a critical mass of critical race scholars in the legal academy, right? And it was just beginning to diversify. It first included African Americans, to some limited degree Asian Americans, and then Latinx people, you know. So, but I would say just looking around at institutions of higher ed in Germany, it's a very pre-desegregation, right, in terms of what the legal academy looks like. And so that will make it an additional challenging hurdle in many ways to theorize, right? Because you do need a sort of critical mass, people in solidarity, right, in order to probably fully develop, right, the analysis going forward. So those are just some initial thoughts on, I guess, the last question. But let me stop here. I've actually talked much more than I had anticipated and turn it over to Xin Li and Professor Arndt.
Yeah.
So we have a solid, basically, base now, and we can invite
Do
it
we think like what energy level wise we do that
now
now,
or
or
after the break?
do you feel like having a break and then going on? I'm fine with either option, just looking. So we stick to the plan and continue? You're still okay, good. Yeah, thank you very much. That was amazing. What you say, a basic introduction was wow, mind blowing, and really covering so many different layers. And I also want to make it quick with having rather one challenge on the term itself and two questions. One thing is, let me start with a challenge. You know, I have a principal unease with inter, with this prefix, because if you look at intercultural, it still implements the idea that cultures are sort of existing and that you can essentialize a German culture versus, you know, that also means that you can exclude Muslim cultures as not belonging to white Christian Germany and so on. Then the same is like, there's a second genuine literary studies theory, intertextuality, which is basically working in a very similar fashion to intersectionality, because it basically means not just, in a way, texts meet and interact, but rather in Christiana's sense, everything is texts. And all texts know each other whether they ever met each other actively or consciously. But it's rather like an ocean, and once in a while there's a wave top, and that's the individual author's text, but basically. And I think intertextuality is not the right term here, because it's not text A interacting with text B. But it's rather a kind of square or intersection. It's to me a transaction. And here comes my question to intersectionality. We still have that idea, like if you have the crossroad thing, it's not it's not street A and plus street B, but it's actually a melting pot where street A merges with street B, and we know there are many different streets at that very spot. So in a way it would be transsectionality to me. And everyone who knows me knows that I love this trans plus an asterisk even, to make it even more fluid and more like into all directions. So what is your take on that? And then, as for intersectionality itself, that is something that is very important for us, also for writing all the proposals, is of course like how it started off. It meant a multi-layered process of discriminating against African American women in particular, but generally. But like many of our work, and you also mentioned that, and I know Shireen is working on that, it's not just a multi-layered version of discrimination against, but also of becoming more aware that you can be powerful on the one structure category while being discriminated on the other. And here come very complex interactions. You know, once I I saw like, I was sitting in a cafe and there was a Roma musician playing, and then there came a homeless person selling this homeless newspaper. And while arriving on that place, he shouted at the Roma musician saying, "This is my place, I'm white." I was wondering, nobody knows what race is about Germany. This guy calls himself white. So, but of course, that was sort of, he was scared, like this was his realm where he usually gets some money to survive. So, but he was not, and it's always that that is the solidarity part. That what also like Fanon says, or like the Marxian workers of all of the world unite. Usually, it's also a bit like divide and rule works in terms of you don't attack those in power, you attack those that seemingly have structure categories that put you in the hierarchy below you, and so that helps you to become more close to power. Something this paradigm. And I hope and I think that intersectionality should be able to address that too.
Yeah, bottom up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it's like, she talks of a prison, it's a concept, and we had it as a kind of theory, but in a way I think it should be considered as a discipline of its own. Because then I'm not a literary scholar, but I'm a scholar of intersectionality studies, and of course it's a long way to go, but this is a chance also to do what Nadine said, like this academic activism. So that I'm often told, like, you are not a true scholar, you are too political. But how can you be an intellectual and not be political? Even to have not an opinion about sexism is political. So, and that's why I think like these intersectionality studies have the potential to actually have something like critical humanity that is per se activist and political. Yeah. And then I'm just a question, because I'm not sure whether I get that right about the post-racial. I totally agree, with Germany, but to me, I'm always a bit afraid about the post. What does it? Do you think the post is something in terms of after? Do you think it's a post in post-colonial? Post in post-colonial ask what did colonialism do to the world structurally and discursively, meaning the sort of effects are still very virulent and full of impact. So maybe you could elaborate on that.
Absolutely. Thank you for those comments. Really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. I'm actually very interested in the etc. problem that you mentioned in the Science article, actually. That, for example, I was looking into the topic of, which I don't think anybody was really looking into, that in Germany, professional Chinese women especially, higher education, they face the glass ceiling, which of course has to do with immigration status, their migration status, their gender, their language, and their linguistic capacities, and so on. But one thing that has been considered less, I think, is about this ideology. That maybe there is a certain lack of, a certain suspicion that is already there before you open your mouth or before people. So it's people judge you by your presumed ideological being, as because you come from China.
Yeah.
And so I was thinking maybe all those etc. problems when we're talking about intersectional analysis. Could there be a paradigm where we could address the contingency of the analysis we're doing right now, right? It's an ethical problem when it comes to it. And also it's at the heart of what intersectionality is about. It's about complexity, it's about open-endedness, and it's about accepting that there are certain aspects that may be overlooked right now, and it's contingent analysis of what is going on dynamically in society for certain. And also that comes to another question, which is, I think, is at the heart of what this concept or framework is about, like the need for collectivity, the need for certain form of collectivity. Or otherwise, people say we're at loss if you promote all those highly deconstructive. Sometimes literary scholars have been critiqued for their trans-textual and trans-deconstructive thinking. And they say, how can we do it, affect real change in the real world without using some certain kind of collectivities? But how do we use that without the power structures that we know should be problematized? And that's also part of it. And I wonder if you have ever thought about how literary study could relate, integrate, or how do they encounter each other in literary studies and intersectionality. Because I remember last time in our workshop, a professor was questioning openly about how intersectionality could be used in literary studies. And that relates back to the question of a need for collectivity. She thinks that intersectionality is some kind of interplay of different categories, I presume, and the complexity that she thinks that literary studies could be able to address. And that somehow translates to the idea that literary study has no agency, that literary study does not affect change in the real world, which we know is not true. So that's all these thoughts.
Those are fabulous questions. I'll start with just a few initial comments, and I don't know if others want to add in after that or if we just want to break. But let me just make some initial responses to these excellent questions that both of you have provided. So I think the first question with regards to the trans versus the inter, right? I think one challenge is, just the idea of the intersection, right, becomes this kind of primary organizing idea, right, versus there's not like a trans section, right? But I think, and then it raises a question of between versus across, right? And I'm not exactly sure, I guess I want to hear more about why you feel the across is so much more primary than the between. However, I do think that the sociologist, my co-author in the science piece, Leslie McCall, did attempt, like within the social sciences, to at least discuss not so much the trans, but a lot of the intra and the inter aspects in terms of methodologies within social science that I find is, was very illuminating. So I guess I'll make that reference to Leslie McCall's work, but I'm very fascinated and would love to hear more about your analysis. And it may connect back to the, literary analysis specifically and the usefulness of some of these terms as well. But that we can see how intersectionality originates out of law that is perhaps less attentive to some of these questions that you're raising. But that could be very productive engagement to consider. I think both of you are giving voice to the salience of resistance and collectivity. And so you're asking, it's not just what is done to intersectional subjects, but it's also how intersectional subjects can resist, right? And I think that that's something that has been at the forefront of intersectionality from the beginning. It's just probably what you're pointing out and observing is that in the basic definitions, it tends to emphasize what you can frame as structural intersectionality, right? And the structures of subordination that interact. And that in large part is to shift away from thinking of intersectionality as categories of identity within the individual, but rather to understand it as structures of inequality, okay? However, after the break, what we're going to focus on is not just structural intersectionality, but also political intersectionality, and the ways in which intersectionality is important to organizing resistance, right? And what is important about that insight that has to pay attention to the coalitions that exist within a category, right? Within race, within gender, the intra dimension, or as you're suggesting, perhaps the trans dimension, right? So I think that definitely is there. and has been talked about as sort of political intersectionality. I think your comment, Professor Arndt, about wanting intersectionality studies to be acknowledged as, let's say, legitimate theory does attend to that second category that we identified in signs with regards to intersectionality studies. And so that there is a very vibrant conversation about these discursive investigations of theory and methodology within the disciplines, right? And that's one very well-established, important strand that sometimes can jump the shark, but also does do, I think, what you are raising, and it tends to say that this is a legitimate form of inquiry and theory in and of itself, right? And is important for institutionalizing not only ideas, but also people, okay? Which kind of also lends to, I think, the comment that you were raising about the challenge of whether or not intersectionality can effectively address the et cetera and the specificity of certain combinations. And there's no reason to think just because it originates with the example of African American women that the ideas cannot be extended to other contexts, right? So I would argue that of course it can, and it's up to our own imagination and execution, which is, that's why I gave you the example of when I tried to develop it, you know, apply it to Asian American women in the context of sexual harassment. There's currently a colleague of mine, Khaled Beydoun, who went through the critical race studies program at UCLA Law School, where Professor Crenshaw teaches among many others. And he's really furthered and developed the whole definition of legal Islamophobia, right? And I raised that just as another illustration where he was also analyzing many of the early cases of whiteness in whiteness studies, of the ways in which Middle Easterners have been racialized as white within US jurisprudence in the early 20th century, in large part consistent with their religion, because so many of those filing those early cases were Christian, right? And therefore then were qualified as white as opposed to Muslim, right? And so there's that variability of looking at the specificity of many of these intersectionalities to help give it, more traction to the problem that you're trying to address. So I would say, in terms of the challenge of literary studies, I'm less familiar with that. I'm more familiar with my own ethnic studies training, but to me, some of the earliest intersectionality theorists in literature, I shared with you my mentor Elaine Kim and Barbara Christian, of course, I think were some of the folks that were early on attempting to formulate, a different method of integrating, different structures that come together to be able to assess the meaning, of literature and how we apply it to our lives. So those were my initial comments. Did anybody else want to respond to these great questions raised by the commentators?
I would like to
Yes.
just maybe, because the way I see intersectionality and work with it just, and I've been like working on that throughout my master project as well, that seeing race and gender at the same time, but the way I see it these days is just like race within gender and gender within race.
Yeah.
It's just like very labyrinth-like. And for me, the project of intersectionality is to be able to unbundle this ongoing, othering basically mechanism. So, because it's just like within the, and I love the juxtaposition of sameness and difference in the whole discussion of intersectionality. and the solidarities, the strategic solidarities that has to be built, but within it and parallel to that, there is already the other subject being formed up and just like developing, and within that, and it goes on and on. So for me, understanding how to unbundle, this whole othering within categories is one way to approach the categories that we are working with, and it's very problematic to work with them. We're constantly using, italic forms and this and that, just like to show our resistance that we do not want to work with that. But what we see as a common trend between them is just like how they basically shake hands and hold hands and empower one another. But the structures of share the structure of othering. So that is one thing, and I would love to know your comments and other people's comments on that. But if not, we can move to the break and then come back and then talk about it.
Well, I'll reserve mine because we will engage this in the second part that I've anticipated in terms of the sort of structural versus political intersectionality. But I would be more interested if anyone else wants to jump in at this point in response to that question or any of the prior ones. Or you guys want a break?
Let's go grab a coffee and then we'll be back.
Okay, that sounds great.
5-10 minutes?
10. Okay. Thank you.